Greenland is larger than any country in Europe and every US state. Greenland is potentially richer than many resource-rich countries. But at the same time, there is only one shopping center here. The average temperature is lower than in any other country in the world, and so few people live in the capital that they could all fit into a single modest stadium. What is Greenland today, and why does Donald Trump want to buy the largest and most unexplored island in the world and annex it to the United States? This is the city of Nuuk. It is arguably the northernmost and coldest capital in the world. Greenland has its own flag, coat of arms, a parliament with 5 parties, and even a prime minister. Officially, it is not a separate country, but an autonomous territory of the Kingdom of Denmark. And Denmark, if you didn't know, is 50 times smaller than Greenland. How did little Denmark manage to grab such a large territory? Because apart from the Scandinavian Vikings and Europeans, no one else really ventured into these harsh lands. It was they who discovered this island and named it Greenland. Greenland. And then they recolonized these lands in the 16th century. Since the climate there is more suitable for polar bears, sheep, and cattle, no one else particularly claimed Greenland. But it's the 21st century now, and in 2020, the US opened a consulate, its official representative office, on the snow-covered island. What happened? Why did the Americans suddenly decide to make their presence felt on the edge of a snow-covered and, in fact, foreign land? I'll show you on the map. Here is the American capital, Washington, and here is Moscow. The shortest route between them lies through Greenland. If intercontinental ballistic missiles or strategic bombers with nuclear weapons ever fly between America and Russia, they will do so through the Arctic. Greenland is the most important point in this sense, as it allows threats to be detected and neutralized as quickly as possible. 5 key facilities with a range of nearly 5,000 kilometers monitor all directions every second. 2 such stations in California and Alaska cover the Pacific Ocean. The Atlantic is covered by a facility in Massachusetts. In Europe, the US uses a Royal Air Force base in the UK, and the northernmost radars are located in Greenland at a US military base. Why does the US have a military base in Greenland? In 1941, the United States concluded an agreement with the Danish government in exile. They allowed the United States to build military facilities on the island. First and foremost, airfields and logistics hubs. There, American bombers and transport planes were refueled and repaired on their way to Europe. These same locations were used to deliver cargo to Great Britain under the Lend-Lease program. In exchange for these convenient options, the US undertook to supply the inhabitants of Greenland with food, medicine, and fuel. They also built weather stations on the island. These were needed to predict the weather in Europe and plan military operations. This was particularly helpful during the Allied landings in Normandy. As a result, the US maintained a permanent military presence from 1941 onward. And even when Denmark was liberated on May 5, 1945, and Greenland officially returned to Danish control, American troops did not leave. First, in 1946, President Harry Truman made a secret offer to buy the island for only $100 million. Denmark did not agree, but they did not expel the Americans from Greenland, because in 1949, the countries joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and in 1951, the US signed a treaty on the defense of Greenland and received official permission to develop its northernmost military base on the island. And the American flag had to fly there alongside the Danish flag. But take a look at this document, which was published by the US Geological Survey in 2022. It contains a list of 50 minerals that are critical to the economy and national security of the United States. Special emphasis was placed on so-called rare earth metals. After all, they are needed to produce all modern electronics and military equipment. And this is exactly where the US has a problem, with rare earth metals. At least 2/3 of their production is controlled by America's main geopolitical and ideological opponent, China. The US itself is heavily dependent on China in many areas. Take yttrium, for example. It is needed to produce refractory materials, lasers, medical equipment, and televisions. American companies purchase 94% of their yttrium from Chinese suppliers, and so on down the list. What does Greenland have to do with it? According to the latest data, it has reserves of 43 of the 50 minerals that are critical to the strategic security of the United States. As you can see, there is a full royal flush of minerals there. Copper, diamonds, gold, graphite, nickel, titanium, those very rare earth metals, zinc, uranium, and in just one explored uranium deposit in the south of the island, the reserves are greater than in the entire United States. and then there are several thousand nuclear warheads that need to be constantly updated. But today, Americans produce virtually no fuel for them and have to buy it. But that's not all. Today, 80% of Greenland's territory is covered by glaciers, sometimes 3 kilometers thick. It is quite difficult to estimate what lies beneath them. If the glaciers continue to melt, access to these resources could become much easier, which would increase the island's strategic value. In addition, older studies suggest that Greenland holds billions of barrels of unexplored oil and gas. But in 2021, the Greenlandic government announced that it would stop issuing licenses to foreign companies for oil exploration in its territory because it feared the environmental consequences. But that was under Biden, and the US administrations have assessed the environmental and economic risks of developing the Arctic territories differently at different times. Trump's interest in Greenland was a public expression of processes that have been discussed in American politics and analysis for more than a decade. Now that he is president of the US again, Trump has business interests in addition to political interests. The logic is simple. Untouched resources are needed to secure the future. Here is a place where many of them are concentrated. It is relatively close. No one is mining them there. We have military bases there. From the point of view of American military strategists, Greenland has long been part of the US defense system in the Arctic. So why do we need extra intermediaries if they have neither an army nor the desire to develop this land? This is logical because in order to continuously extract minerals in the conditions of the far north, Greenland needs specialists, miners, and simply people who will cook food for the workers and transport resources from the mines to the sea. It has been calculated that each such raw material site requires an average of 300 people. But where to find them? On an island the size of Western Europe or 3 Texases, there are only about 57,000 people, and the official unemployment rate in Greenland is less than 2%. This means that in order to develop Greenland's deposits, tens of thousands of people will have to be brought in, essentially turning the country into a magnet for migrant workers, just like the United Arab Emirates or Qatar, only this time above the Arctic Circle with an average temperature of minus 18 degrees Celsius. Independent large-scale development of Greenland or Denmark's resources would require financial and human resources that they do not currently have. Moreover, the island is not officially part of the European Union. The northernmost part of Greenland is only 36 kilometers from Canada. So who is ready to take on the challenge? China? But who would let them in? Therefore, it will be much easier for the US to develop the resources once Greenland legally becomes their 51st state, and the Greenlanders themselves have serious questions about how the Danish government manages their land. Here is Greenland's demographic pyramid. It shows how many people of what age and gender live on the island. As you can see, there is a strange gap here. Things like this happen when something very bad happens to the normal life of a society. But in Greenland, there have been no reports of wars, revolutions, or economic crises. So what is happening there in the mid-1970s? The Danish government is secretly and without the consent of the local population installing intrauterine devices in Greenlandic women and girls of childbearing age. Yes, so that they would not procreate and multiply. Because in Greenland in the early 1960s, there was a sharp increase in the birth rate, which so frightened the authorities in Copenhagen. The government decided that they would not be able to cope with the rapidly growing population in the colony and would lose it. Even earlier, a social project was devised for Greenland to create a Danish-speaking elite. What was this? Denmark took 22 children aged between 4 and 9 from the island to raise them as a new elite. Initially, it is planned that these will only be children without parents, but in the end, some children are taken from their families. They are forbidden to speak their native language and are taught Danish. They live with foster families. Then they are returned home to Greenland, not to their parents, but to a special shelter. Of course, they did not become an elite. All that happened was that their lives were ruined. This is not a conspiracy theory or a rumor. These facts were later officially recognized by Denmark itself. You can understand that after such stories, the Greenlanders do not have a particular love for the Danes. And according to the latest polls, more than half of the people on the island want independence. We don't want to be Danes, we don't want to be Americans, we want to be Greenlanders. This is a perfectly normal desire. But, as the entire history of humanity shows, diplomacy only works well with guns, and when you don't have them, you yourself become a target. For example, The US first considered buying the island back in 1867, but at exactly the same time, the Americans acquired another northern territory, Alaska. This decision was pushed through by the then US Secretary of State William Seward. He also proposed options for Greenland and Iceland, but Congress agreed to spend money only on one park for polar bears. That is what Alaska was called in American newspapers. But Greenland in those years was no better. Distant, cold, and useless. The island resurfaced in American interest for the second time at the beginning of the 20th century during World War I, when Germany could not be allowed to take control of the Virgin Islands in the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, they belonged to Denmark, which posed a direct threat to the Panama Canal, recently opened by the Americans. Moreover, according to the Monroe Doctrine, any attempt by European powers to spread their political system to any part of the Western Hemisphere was dangerous to the peace and security of the U.S. Something had to be done. As a result, in 1917, the U.S. agreed to buy the Virgin Islands from Denmark for $25 million. At the same time, the U.S. would not object to the Danish government extending its political and economic interests to the whole of Greenland. But why then, in 1917, did Washington no longer need Greenland? At the beginning of the 20th century, if the island was good for anything, it was only for producing icebergs. One of them, incidentally, would sink the Titanic. But times were changing. The strategic importance of the Arctic territories grew, so the Americans found a moment and a way to come to Greenland and use it as a military base. And now it was time to get their hands on the resources. After all, if there was anywhere on Earth left with a treasure island, this was it, and it was the largest in the world. Moreover, it is thanks to the enormous size of Greenland that little Denmark today claims the North Pole and all its potential resources. Plus, there is another important argument for Trump himself. Once, at the beginning of the 19th century, the third American president, Thomas Jefferson, made the largest and most successful purchase of land in the history of the United States. Here it is, the huge French territory of Louisiana, 2 million square kilometers. And the U.S. bought it from Napoleon for $15 million, or 7 cents per hectare. So if Trump manages to buy Greenland, it will be larger in size, which means that Trump could break this record and go down in history as the greatest collector of American land. Greenland is an example of how geography, technology, and global politics are changing the significance of territories. For a long time, this island was considered remote and insignificant. Today, it is simultaneously a military stronghold, a potential resource base, and home to a small but distinct people. The question of Greenland's future is not just a question of who legally owns it, it is a question of who will make decisions and under what conditions in a world where climate, resources, and security are increasingly intertwined, and that is why interest in this cold island will only grow in the coming decades. But Greenland is not the only place where the United States exerts its influence. There is a country much closer to America, far more dependent on it and far more vulnerable. You can learn more about it in this video. If you like the video, don't forget to like and share it. See you in the future.